On a day when Australia's been warned again about electricity shortages in coming summers, it's a great day to catch up with the Copenhagen Consensus Centre President Bjorn Lomborg, joining us live from Malmo in Sweden. Good to talk to you again, Bjorn. You've been watching Australia very, very closely. You might not have heard overnight that our energy market operator has warned us yet again that our power supplies are less than that expected and that South Australia, Victoria and New South Wales could face electricity shortages from this summer and going into the next decade.
Well, it's no big surprise, right? I mean, fundamentally, we're being told that solar and wind is cheaper than fossil fuels. But the reality, of course, is they're only cheaper when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. But everyone needs power 24/7. And so you really have to take that into account. And when you do, it, of course, turns out that it's much, much more expensive. Now, we can still keep our lights on, but it's going to be more and more costly. And that, I think, is the real challenge to believing that we're just magically going to transition to green energy.
There are too many people, I think, not the viewers of this program, but there are too many people in our public debate that don't seem to understand the basics of this, the basic engineering. And you wrote recently with a beautiful and obvious analogy relating to solar cars. We've made our electricity grid a bit like a solar car.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you imagine offering the public a cheap solar car, that actually sounds like, oh, I'd like one of those. Until, of course, you realize when the sun is not shining, when it's overcast or at night, you actually need a backup gasoline car. So you have to buy two cars. Sure, you're saving when you're driving your solar car, but you actually have to pay twice the capital cost. And then you also have to pay the gasoline when it's overcast or at night. And so the reality here is there is a good reason why most nations don't actually do just switch over to solar and wind. I emphasize, and I think nobody's really pointed this out in the statistics, if you look at the big countries in the world, so the Chinas and so on, we believe that they are becoming ever more green. But the reality is last year, China got more power from coal than it did, more additional power than it did from solar and wind. And if you look at some of the other countries, you know, Indonesia got 90 times as much more from coal than it did from solar and wind. And so reality is, yes, you can build up some solar and wind, but you are actually going to end up paying a lot of money if you try to do too much.
This is where I'd love to get your global perspective on this, because I wrote on the weekend about how Iceland has the greatest penetration of renewables. They're blessed with lots of thermal energy from volcanic geography, of course, and they have hydro, so they're almost entirely renewable. Good on them. But in the rest of the world, is there an economy even vaguely comparable to Australia that's trying to do as much as Australia, that's actually trying to pretend that a renewables plus storage model can power a modern economy?
No, and I don't even think Australia is succeeding in that either. So look, hydro is a great idea. You can do some solar and wind. So for instance, in California, if you have like 10% solar, it actually works really well, because when the sun is strongest around midday is also when you need air conditioning the most. So there is a good overlap for some of these things, but trying to get anywhere close to 100% is going to be almost impossible for any nation. So again, if you have lots of hydro, great, and you should definitely be using that. But we need to realize that unless we find technologies that actually allow us to run power 24/7, that could, for instance, be fourth generation nuclear, we're not going to be able to do this just with solar and wind. And when we're trying, it's just going to end up being incredibly costly. Just one thing that I think we're missing is, what are we going to do with all the waste that's coming out both from solar and wind? One recent period study showed just the solar waste is going to double the actual cost of solar. And of course, we're talking about something that's just below fossil fuels right now. Double that, and it's nowhere near competitive. We don't take that into account, but we should.
Yeah, I noticed one of our local councils charging $35 a pop for people to get rid of their solar panels. They've got to replace them every 15 years at a couple of $100 each, plus pay $35 each to get rid of the old ones. And as you say, where are we going to put them all? This is the trouble in Australia, right? There's hope because the coalition are talking sensibly about nuclear. We should have started on that 2 decades ago, but better late than never. Yet the market operator today, to fix this looming crisis, they're just recommending more renewables and more transmission. It can't do the job, can it?
Probably not. More transmission could be part of the solution, but the fundamental problem is, of course, still, you can't have a situation where you're relying on mostly something that only works when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. And yes, there is some evidence that if you have a very wide grid, but again, almost nobody does that. And certainly I would imagine that most of the interconnectors in Australia would be in the same region. You're still back to the problem of saying, what are you going to do when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing? We need to recognize that currently you need a lot more storage, and that's going to make it unaffordable. Just to give you one example, a recent period study showed that for the US, if you actually want to run just on solar or just on wind, you're going to need backup in the equivalent of 3 months of electricity production. Right now, the US has about 7 minutes. So no, we're not going to be able to do that. Doing that with batteries would cost the US about 5 times its GDP every 15 years.
It's just that implausible, that impossible. Thanks for bringing that clarity to us again, Bjorn. I really appreciate it.